When people picture medieval war, they usually picture swords first. But on real European battlefields, the sword was often the backup, carried by knights and soldiers, but not the main tool that decided most fights. The weapons that truly shaped outcomes were the ones that controlled distance, broke formations, punished armor, or killed from far away. That's what this list is about. 9 medieval weapons that were often deadlier than a sword, not because they looked cooler, but because they worked better in the messy reality of medieval battles. Crowded lines, heavy armor, horses, mud, sieges, and panic. Number 1. Spears and pikes. A sword looks like the star of the Middle Ages, but on an actual battlefield it was usually a backup. The weapon doing most of the serious work was the spear, and later its longer cousin, the pike. The reason is simple: reach beats style. A spear puts a sharp point out in front of you by a couple of meters. A pike can push that point out 4, 5, even 6 meters, depending on the period and the troops using it. That extra distance changes everything. A sword fight is a close enough to touch problem. A spear line is a don't let them get close problem. And that's a much safer way to win when you're standing next to hundreds of other nervous people in a packed formation. Spears were also cheap and fast to make compared to good swords. You didn't need perfect steel and fancy grinding. You needed a straight shaft and a solid head, and suddenly you could arm a whole village levy. Training mattered, of course, but spear training scales well. You can teach people to keep a line, present points forward, and move together. That's not the same as producing expert duelists, but battles aren't duels. Battles are pressure, noise, confusion, and limited visibility, where a wall of points is terrifying even before anyone actually gets hit. Against cavalry, spears and pikes get even nastier. Horses are brave, but they don't like running into a forest of sharp sticks. A disciplined spear line can force a charge to slow, split, or stop, and once the momentum is gone, the riders lose their biggest advantage. Even when armor improves, the spear stays relevant because it's not only about punching through plate, it's about controlling space. It's about making the other side hesitate, bunch up, and break formation. It's also about numbers. If you have a spear and your friend has a spear, you can both threaten the same target at the same time. With swords, the range is shorter, and the crowding gets worse. When you picture medieval infantry doing real work, picture them with spear shafts locked forward and feet braced, not swinging swords like movie heroes. And once armies started leaning into longer infantry formations, especially in the late Middle Ages, pikes became the backbone of units that could stand up to armored men and even push them back. The sword still mattered, but mostly after the spearwork had already decided who was winning. Now, if you take that reach advantage and add more tools on the end, you get a whole family of weapons that can do more than just thrust. Number 2, halberds and bills. A halberd or a bill is basically a spear that decided it wanted options. Instead of only a point, you get a mix of blade, spike, and hook. That design is brutally practical for medieval combat, especially once armor becomes common. The top spike still threatens at distance, which keeps the basic spear advantage. The axe-like blade adds chopping power against lighter armor, shields, and unarmored limbs. And the hook is the quiet killer feature. It lets you control people. That means you're not relying on a clean hit the way sword fights often do. You can catch a shield edge, yank it out of position, and open a line. You can hook a leg or an arm to unbalance someone. You can snag a rider or the tack and try to pull them off a horse, which is huge because a knight on the ground is suddenly much less scary. These weapons also fit medieval battlefield logic. They work well in tight groups. One soldier can press with the point while another steps in to hook or chop. You can also shift grips quickly, hands wide for leverage, hands closer for quicker movements, without needing to change weapons. That flexibility is one reason polearms became so dominant in late medieval infantry. Places that produced effective foot soldiers leaned into them hard. Swiss troops became famous for disciplined infantry tactics, and halberds show up constantly in that world, both as battlefield tools and as symbols of professional infantry. In England, bills were common, and they did the same kind of job. Reach, control, and ugly effectiveness at close range. Another reason halberds and bills outclass swords is the simple math of force. A long handle acts like a lever. You don't need to be a giant to generate a lot of impact, and you don't need a perfect edge to be dangerous. You can smash, hook, shove, and thrust, and each of those actions can break an opponent's rhythm. When fights turn into a pushing contest, formation against formation, swords struggle because they're too short to reach past the front rank. Polearms can. They stay useful longer in the moment when battles get decided, the shove, the collapse, the panic. But there's one polearm that deserves its own spotlight because it wasn't just a soldier's tool. It was built for the armored elite when they fought on foot. Number 3, the poleaxe. If you want a weapon designed to deal with a fully armored knight, the poleaxe is one of the best answers medieval Europe produced. It's not a peasant spear. It's a purpose-built armored combat tool, and it shows. A typical poleaxe has a stout shaft, usually around a man's height, with a heavy head that combines an axe blade, a hammer face or flanges, and a spike. Often there's a top spike for thrusting, and sometimes a back spike for punching into weak points. The key idea is versatility under pressure. In full plate, cutting is not the main problem you're trying to solve. Plate is meant to make cuts slide off, so you use mechanics that armor hates: concentrated impact and leverage. A hammer face can shock through armor, especially if it lands cleanly and you can follow up. A spike can threaten gaps, armpits, visor slits, joints, without requiring a long, delicate sword thrust. And because it's on a haft, you get reach and control. You can jab like a spear, but you can also steer a person with the shaft, pushing, pulling, and turning their balance against them. That's why in a lot of late medieval fighting manuals, you see poleaxes used with grappling logic. It's not just swing and pray, it's step in, bind the opponent's weapon or arms, move their weight, and then hit where it counts. The poleaxe also makes sense socially. Knights trained for years, and they could afford specialized gear. On foot, in close formations or in controlled combats, the poleaxe gave them a way to handle other armored professionals without pretending a sword edge could do miracles against steel. Swords still existed in that world, but notice how the sword technique shifts. Half-swording becomes common, where you grip the blade to use the point like a short spear. That alone tells you something. When you have to hold your sword by the blade to make it work against armor, you're already admitting the sword isn't the best tool for the job. The poleaxe is basically that admission turned into a dedicated weapon. Reach when you need it, heavy impact when you need it, and a point for the moments when a gap opens. And if you take that concentrate force into a small area idea and shrink it down into a weapon you can swing in tight spaces, you land right on the next category. Number 4, Warhammers. Warhammers look almost underwhelming until you remember what they're meant to do. They aren't made to cut. They're made to dump a lot of force into a small spot. A sword spreads impact along an edge and relies on sharpness and angle. A hammer face doesn't care about sharpness. It cares about contact. Even if it doesn't break through armor, it can stun, knock down, and create openings. And medieval fights are full of openings. People slipping, losing balance, getting crowded, or getting grabbed. A warhammer takes advantage of those messy moments. Many warhammers also have a spike or beak on the back, sometimes called a bec de corbin in certain forms. That spike is a direct answer to plate armor. Plate is strong when it can spread force. A narrow spike denies it that advantage. The goal isn't always to punch straight through like a fantasy video game. Often it's about catching edges, denting plates, targeting thinner sections, and making the opponent's body take the shock. It's also about control. A beak can bite into armor surfaces, which can help with pulling or dragging someone off balance, especially if the opponent is already under pressure. Another advantage is size. A hammer can be used in close quarters, where longer polearms are awkward, like in a crush of men, near fortifications, or once two formations have collided. It's also easy to pair with a shield, or use from horseback. A rider can swing down with a hammer and still keep one hand for reins, which fits how medieval cavalry actually operated. A sword can do that too, but again, against good armor, the sword often becomes a find-the-gap tool. The hammer stays honest. It's designed for the armor era, and it's psychologically nasty in a practical way. People can ignore a sword scratch on a breastplate. They don't ignore getting hit hard enough to lose footing or breathe wrong. None of that needs graphic description to be clear. Blunt force is a real problem even when steel protects the skin. But sometimes you don't want a concentrated point like a beak. Sometimes you want repeated, reliable impact that doesn't snag, doesn't depend on perfect alignment, and works well in a crowd. That's where the mace earns its reputation. Number 5. Flanged maces. The mace is the low-drama, high-result weapon of armored warfare. It's basically a club that medieval engineers took seriously. Instead of a smooth ball, many maces use flanges, raised ridges, so the impact concentrates into narrower lines. That makes the hit more effective without turning it into a tool that gets stuck like an axe head can. A flanged mace is great for a battlefield because it's consistent. You don't need a perfect edge. You don't need to worry about your blade rolling on a bad strike. You swing, you connect, and the target feels it. Against mail armor, the mace can be devastating because mail is excellent at stopping cuts, but not as good at stopping the energy of a heavy blow. Against plate, a mace won't always beat through like people imagine, but it can dent, shock, and disrupt. The real point is that it changes the fight's rhythm. If you get hit hard enough to stagger, your guard falls apart for a second. In medieval combat, a second is plenty. The mace also plays well with formation fighting. In a tight press, you often can't wind up for a big sword cut anyway. You need compact strikes, short arcs, quick recoveries. A mace does that. It's also tough and simple to maintain. Swords demand care. Edges chip, blades bend, and good steel is valuable. A mace is mostly solid mass, which is a practical advantage when you're campaigning, traveling, and dealing with bad weather, mud, and constant wear. That's why you see maces used by a lot of different types of fighters, not only knights. It's also why maces become symbols of authority in some contexts. They look blunt, direct, and hard to argue with. And there's a final, very real advantage. Maces are good at forcing compliance without needing a perfect, lethal strike. Medieval battles had prisoners, ransoms, and captures. A weapon that can disable without relying on cutting through armor fits that reality. Now, if all of this sounds like it's drifting away from the romantic sword duel idea, that's because medieval combat often drifted away from it too. When armor and grappling enter the picture, the most dangerous weapon can become something much smaller than a sword, used at breath distance, after the big weapons have done their pushing and striking. Number 6. Rondel daggers. The Rondel dagger looks simple, a stiff blade with a round guard and round pommel, designed so your hand doesn't slide forward. That simplicity hides what it's really for. This is a weapon built for the moment when armor makes normal cuts pointless, and a fight turns into a wrestling match with steel on. In armored combat, a sword can still matter, but often as a thrusting tool, and even then, you're hunting for openings. The dagger is made for that hunting. It's stiff, so it doesn't bend easily. It's narrow, so it can fit into gaps. It's short, so you can use it when bodies are pressed together and long weapons have no room to work. In practice, the Rondel dagger becomes a finishing tool and a survival tool. If you fall, if you get grabbed, if someone's trying to pin your weapon arm, the dagger is what you can still reach. That's why it shows up constantly in late medieval combat manuals alongside grappling techniques. The logic is straightforward. You bind and control first, then you use the dagger where armor is weakest. That might mean joints, visor areas, under the arm, or other openings that exist because a human still needs to move and breathe inside the metal. This is also where the sword's reputation gets a reality check. People sometimes talk like a sword is the ultimate medieval weapon, but a sword is a compromise. It's a good all-rounder. It's fast, it can cut and thrust, and it's handy. But in a world of plate armor, the all-rounder stops being the best tool for certain jobs. The dagger is a specialist for the worst-case scenario. Close contact, no space, armor everywhere, and both fighters exhausted. It's also easy to carry and always available. Even soldiers who couldn't afford fancy swords could carry a knife or dagger, and that mattered in the chaos after formations break. Another detail people miss: Medieval warfare isn't just the big clash. It's raids, ambushes, night alarms, fighting in narrow streets, pushing through doorways, and struggling in trenches and around wagons. In all those settings, a short stabbing weapon can be more immediately dangerous than a long blade that needs room to swing. And once you start thinking in terms of, how do you hurt someone who's protected, it naturally leads into weapons that bypass close combat entirely. Because the safest way to beat an armored fighter is not to grapple them at all. It's to hit them from a distance with something that arrives fast and hard. Number 7, the crossbow. The crossbow is one of the most practical equalizer weapons of medieval Europe. It takes muscle and training out of the equation and replaces them with a machine that stores energy. You draw it with your hands, your feet, or a winding device, lock the string, aim, and release. That mechanism matters because it means you can train a capable crossbowman faster than you can train someone to use a heavy warbow at a high level. Crossbows also make it easier to hold a drawn shot while you aim, which is a big deal in real conditions: wind, noise, uneven ground, and targets that only show themselves briefly. In sieges, crossbows are especially nasty. Defenders can lean out, take a careful shot, and pull back. Attackers can use pavises, large shields, to cover reloads and keep pressure on walls. The bolts, often shorter and stiffer than arrows, carry a lot of punch. Against mail and lighter armor, a well-made crossbow with the right bolt head can be extremely dangerous, and at close ranges, it can threaten even better protection depending on quality and angle. People love to argue about, can it pierce plate? And the honest answer is, sometimes, at the right range, in the right conditions, against the right plate. What matters historically is that crossbows were dangerous enough that armored elites took them seriously. That alone tells you they weren't just a gimmick. Crossbows also fit medieval logistics. You can keep them loaded for a while, with care, which helps in ambush situations or when you need to react quickly. They're also consistent. Once the mechanism is built well, it produces repeatable power shot after shot. And unlike bows, crossbows don't demand the same lifelong physical adaptation. A strong bow changes the archer's body over years. A crossbow changes the battlefield faster because you can field more competent shooters sooner. That's why crossbowmen show up as important troops in many European armies, including city militias and professional mercenaries. The drawback is rate of fire. Even a skilled crossbowman is usually slower than a skilled longbow archer, so the crossbow is deadly, but in a different way. Careful shots, strong impact, steady pressure, and a weapon that punishes anyone who exposes themselves for too long. And that sets up a natural comparison, because medieval Europe also produced a ranged weapon that sacrificed ease of training for raw volume of fire. Number 8, the longbow. The longbow, especially the heavy warbows associated with late medieval England and Wales, is deadly for a reason that's almost boring. It can put a lot of arrows into the air very quickly, and battles hate being under constant incoming fire. A trained longbow archer can loose multiple aimed shots in the time it takes many crossbowmen to wind, set, and fire once. That rate of fire isn't just about kills, it's about control. An arrow storm forces troops to raise shields, lower heads, bunch up, and slow down. It disrupts formation, and disruption is where medieval armies start to unravel. Longbows also had impressive range in battlefield terms, meaning archers could start influencing a fight before melee troops even touched. Again, the can it punch through plate argument shows up here too, and the responsible take is the same. Sometimes, under the right conditions, especially at closer ranges and against weaker points, but not as a guaranteed armor delete button. What the longbow absolutely does do is punish anything less protected than the best plate. It punishes horses, it punishes faces and hands, it punishes men in mixed armor, and it punishes the simple fact that not everyone on a medieval battlefield is a fully plated knight. Most people aren't. Most are men-at-arms in varied gear, infantry in mail or padded armor, and levies with whatever they could afford. Against that reality, longbows are terrifying. They also become deadlier when used intelligently with terrain and obstacles. If archers are positioned behind stakes, ditches, muddy ground, or on a slope, They can keep firing while the enemy struggles to close distance. That's one reason longbows are linked to famous battles in the 100 Years' War. The archers weren't magic. The setup mattered: position, protection, and disciplined shooting. There's also the human factor. Longbow armies worked because the skill was built into society over time. It takes years to draw a heavy bow repeatedly, aim well, and keep doing it under stress. When a state or region can produce that kind of trained manpower at scale, the battlefield changes. The longbow doesn't just kill, it creates a constant threat that the enemy has to solve. And solving it usually means charging into bad ground while getting shot the whole way. That pressure makes mistakes more likely, and medieval battles often turn on mistakes. But even the longbow, as brutal as it can be, still sits inside a world where armor is improving and fortifications dominate strategy. And once gunpowder weapons mature, they start bending both armor and castles in ways that bows and swords simply can't match. Number 9. Gunpowder weapons. Late medieval Europe didn't wake up one day with modern firearms, but gunpowder still hit warfare like a slow-moving earthquake. At first, you get hand cannons and cruder firearms. Awkward, loud, and not always reliable. Early guns weren't about pinpoint accuracy. They were about delivering heavy impact at short to medium ranges with relatively simple training compared to elite archery. The projectile doesn't need an edge. It doesn't need a perfect angle. It hits hard, and it changes what safe armor means over time. Early on, good plate could still offer real protection in many cases, but the trend line is obvious. As guns improve, the cost and weight of armor that can resist them rises, and eventually it becomes a losing race for many soldiers. That's already a huge reason gunpowder weapons can be deadlier than a sword. A sword is personal and short range. A firearm threatens you before you can reach the enemy, and it keeps threatening you as more troops learn to use it. The bigger shift comes with artillery. Medieval warfare is heavily shaped by castles and city walls. Sieges are the main event in many campaigns, and swords do almost nothing to a stone wall. Traditional siege engines like trebuchets can be effective, but they're slow, bulky, and often require long setups. Cannons bring a new kind of concentrated force. Early bombards were massive and logistically painful, but even when they were clumsy, they pushed fortification design in a new direction. Walls that were tall and relatively thin to resist ladders and rams become a liability when you're facing repeated heavy impacts. Defenders start lowering walls, thickening them, angling them, adding earthworks, and redesigning strongpoints so they can absorb and return fire. That's not an overnight change, but it's a clear shift in what works. On the battlefield, gunpowder adds another kind of fear factor: noise, smoke, and sudden casualties that don't care how noble you are. That matters in medieval armies, where morale and cohesion can collapse faster than people like to admit. A line that's steady under arrows might still panic when unfamiliar blasts start punching through shields and armor. And because firearms reward drilling and formation control, they fit the broader late medieval trend toward more organized infantry and professionalized warfare. In that world, the sword doesn't disappear, but it keeps sliding toward a sidearm and a symbol. Something you carry, something you might use in a scramble, but not the main system that wins fights. Gunpowder weapons become a system. Crews, powder supplies, wagons, specialists, and tactics built around delivering force at distance. When that system shows up in enough numbers, it doesn't just outmatch the sword. It makes the sword feel like it belongs to a different kind of war.